Days when the Dukes weren't hazardous. She's only 17, made us curious. It was a carefree time. How about we jump back and rewind? We were living on Winger and a prayer. Just garbage pail kids with mullets and big hair. Let's open up another pack. Gen X wants their future back. Break out the denim jackets and faded band patches. Share memories, Polaroid captured. It's the Gen X marks the spot podcast.
From the Wherever I May Roam studio, it's Gen X Marks the Spot podcast, and I'm your host, Joe Augustine. You know, there are some artists who just change the game, and Eddie Van Halen was one of those guys. A guitarist who, hell, why am I even telling you this? You know what he has done. He was the ultimate game changer when it came to guitar solos, to music. I will just say this. Eddie Van Halen, he just didn't play the guitar. He grabbed it by the neck and tapped on it in ways that made everyone go, wait, you can do that? Well, hell yeah, if you're Eddie Van Halen. And to quote the great wrestler Ric Flair, often imitated, never duplicated. And my guest today, I get to sit down with someone who didn't just witness this genius from the nosebleed seats. He had a backstage pass for 26 years from 1977 to 2003. My guest today is Steve Rosen, a professional music journalist with a career spanning over 50 years. And when I say a career, I mean the man has published well over 1,000 articles in major publications. We're talking Rolling Stone, Circus, Playboy, Guitar Player, Guitar World, the Los Angeles Times. I could go on. And for those 26 years, he has been everywhere Eddie has gone. He has lived everything Eddie has lived through, and he has the cassette tapes to prove it. Steve's latest work is Tonechaser, Understanding Edward, my 26-year journey with Edward Van Halen. This is not just another rock biography. Nah, this is the real deal. A quarter-century relationship between a music journalist and a legend. And Steve, he talks openly and honestly. And you can tell he's very vulnerable about his relationship that didn't end so well with Eddie Van Halen. It's kind of like unfinished business. And I think we can all relate to that in one way or another. You know, that one wish just for one moment, one more laugh, one more chance to say what needed said to someone who mattered to you, but unfortunately is no longer with us. And that's some heavy stuff, man. And I think for Steve, writing this biography of Eddie Van Halen is somewhat of a closure. And we're going to talk about that and a whole hell of a lot more. So let's dive her down. Here's Steve Rosen. So Steve, welcome to the Gen X Marks the Spot podcast. I must say, I am humbled to have you on my show. You are a legend in the rock and roll community as a writer, and there are so many titles that you could be given. I am appreciative of you being on the show.
Very welcome, Joseph. I appreciate that. Very kind introduction, man.
You have interviewed hundreds of rock legends over the course of 50 years. What made you finally decide in 2020 to write the Tonechaser after the material had been sitting for about 2 decades?
Actually, the material had been sitting for about 3 to 4 decades, to be honest.
Wow.
You know, I don't know if I have if there was one overriding thing that was inside me that said, you got to sit down now and write that book. You know, you got to do this now. I think it was just the accumulation of the years gone by. So I sort of stopped hanging out with Edward in 2003. And to be honest, if you've read the book, for those out there listening who maybe read the book, if you haven't read the book, I don't want to give the ending away. The relationship didn't end well. It got pretty mean-spirited. Edward was going through some changes in his life, and I don't know if he was in a happy place in his life. So when the relationship ended, the last thing I wanted to do was write a book. I'll be honest. I was mad. I was upset. I was hurt by the way things ended. Let me go backwards just a little bit, give you a little bit of a backstory. So if we go back to 1986, I'd been friends with Edward for about 9 years at that point. I meet him in July 77. And in 1986, I approached him because I believed at that point, writers were going to come up to him and say, hey, man, I want to write your life story. At that point in time, Van Halen was arguably one of the biggest bands in the world. Certainly, he was one of the most important guitar players in the world. I thought they were going to come out of the woodwork and descend on him and say, hey, I want to write your story. I want to write your life story. And I'm saying to myself, well, I want to be the person to write that story. So I approach him one day and I say, Edward, listen, man, I know writers are going to come to you. They're going to want to write the story of your life. I would like to be that person, And I figure he's going to want to go away and take some time and ruminate about that. But literally, 10 seconds later, he takes a puff off his cigarette and says, yeah, man, it would have to be you. I can't think of anybody else. So that was pretty remarkable. That felt pretty great. So for about the next 4 years, I actually worked on what was going to be his authorized biography. I was doing lots of interviews with friends, with people who promoted his shows back in Pasadena in preparation for sitting down to write the book. The book never happened, of course. Our relationship goes on, as I mentioned, until 2003. It ends pretty badly. Over the course of those 17 years, there was part of me that really didn't want to think about him. To be honest with you, it was impossible to ignore Van Halen. They got back together in 2003 for what was really a pretty disastrous reunion. Edward was not in a good place. He was not playing well by anybody's standards. That's not just me saying that. And then they go on and they release a different kind of truth, which, again, to be honest, I didn't think was great. It was kind of made up of kind of material that they kind of had, and it was kind of cobbled together. So it was impossible to not be aware of Edward and Van Halen. They're online every day. But I still had no burning desire to sit down and write that book that never happened, But I guess it was probably around 2018, 2019. I had some friends who knew that I was going to write the book back in 1986. And they said, hey, man, you should write the book. And I said, I don't know. I don't know, man. I don't know if I have it in me. And by that, I meant to sort of write this book about hanging out with this guy for 26 years, going back literally to 1977. At that point was, I can't do the math. What is that, 44 years or 45 years? It was like, can I even remember what happened? Can I remember those moments? How do I remember that stuff? And I had all the interviews I had done with him, and I had all the interviews I'd done with all of those other people in preparation for what was going to be the authorized biography. So I did have that, but still I was unsure about it. And honestly, I didn't know if I was up to it as a journalist. I looked at it like this. I go, look, Edward Van Halen is arguably the most important guitar player who ever lived. And if not the most important, certainly one of the 4 or 5 most important guitar players, right? There was Jimi Hendrix, there's Edward. In my mind, there was Jeff Beck. maybe in one or two others. I mean, if you really want to go back, I mean, yes, you could say that Chuck Berry needed to be in there, but I'm looking at people who really changed everything. And in my mind, Edward was one of those people. So I thought to myself, if I'm going to sit down to write this book, it has to be on a level, on a literary sort of plane that he was on a musical plane. In other words, I wanted the book to be as amazing to read as if you were somebody listening to one of his guitar solos. You know what I mean? I wanted the book to read like one long, perfect guitar solo, no misplaced notes and highs and lows. And I didn't know if I was capable of that. I sort of moved away from the journalism thing. I really hadn't been writing for about 4 or 5 years, doing the magazine thing, so I hadn't really written that much. And so a long answer to your question, Joseph, I don't know what compelled me. At a point in time, I just thought, well, you know what, let me sit down and see what comes out. So I remember going in, and I remember the date because it was my birthday, August 24th, 2020. And I go in and I have sort of these, ideas that, well, this is, how do I start this book? Where on this fucking earth do I start, And so I sit down and I just start writing. And I've always loved books that have had amazing kind of intros, the opening paragraph has to be fantastic, So I just started messing around with stuff. And I ended up writing that first paragraph. And when I got done with it, I said, hey, you know what? That's pretty good. But the real litmus test was going to be coming back the next day and reading it, and having lived with it for 24 hours and coming back, and I was ready to read it and go, this is terrible. I got to start over, or look, man, maybe the book isn't meant to be. But I read it and I thought, wow, this is pretty good. It's pretty interesting. It's different. So I just tried to follow my nose and just kept writing, and I got through the intro, which was a very long intro. And typically introductions for those kinds of sort of biographies are like 3 or 4 or 5 pages. I think I was at 15 or 16 pages. I mean, you just didn't write intros that were that long, but I thought, hey, you know what? It's my book. I'm just gonna go with it. If it's that long, it's that long. And then I kept going, and I'm in chapter 1. And I start writing, and I kind of find that voice, internally, and I kind of, you try to follow that. And it was going really well. And when I think about it now, actually, I think one of the reasons I really did want to write the book is because, again, I hadn't spoken to Edward in 17 years. I thought that the book was maybe a bridge, that I could build to reach out to him again. And hey, Edward, look, we haven't spoken in all these years, but I did write the book about our friendship, and I'd love to get you a book. Edward was not a big reader, and I think in all the time that I was with him, I don't think he ever read one story I'd ever written, much less any story I'd ever written about him. So I didn't think it was like he was going to sit down and read the book, front to back. But I thought he might look on it like, wow, it's a big book. Steve must have taken the time. And I was hoping he would think, look, I do trust him, and I'm sure the book is honest. And so I was hoping that would open some doors, at least a dialogue of some sort. And so what happens about 6 weeks after I begin the book on August 24th, on October 6th, Edward Van Halen passes away. And I'm about 3 or 4 chapters in, and now I think, oh my God, what do I do now? Do I continue? Is that betraying his legacy if I go ahead and write the book and he's not here? Will fans think, oh, that Rosen just wrote the book, to just to write the book, and he has no right to write it, But I thought what I had written up to then was really good, honestly. And I thought, look, I'm just going to continue going on the book. And if it never gets published and no one ever reads it, that would be okay. I mean, look, that wasn't my reason for writing the book. Any author who tells you, oh, I just wrote it for myself, they're liars. A book is too much hard work to just write it and have it sit on a shelf and not let anybody read it. So of course I wanted people to read it, but the very worst case, I had to finish the book. I thought if I didn't, there would always be this hole sort of inside me saying, you should have written it, man, you should have written it. So I ended up writing the book. It took me 14 months, which for me was a very long time to write a book. I'd written several books previous to that, and I think the longest one was like 3 or 4 months. And at the end of it all, I was really happy with what I'd done. So in a long answer to your question, Joseph, I think it was just a combination of things. It was something that I felt I had to do, and I guess the other side of that, when I think about it, once I got into it, was I was lucky enough to be there at a place and time, and I met him before the first record comes out. So before he becomes this huge, shooting star. And I was able to sort of hang out with him on a day-to-day basis. And on top of that, I was a writer. So I was able to do interviews with him and capture moments, And I realized that I was maybe the only person in the world who ever had those experiences. And part of me thought, as a journalist, well, I want to share that, but I need to share that. I think that people would, learn a lot from reading about those experiences, And so again, there were a lot of reasons, to write the book, and I'm really happy that I did write it, because the response has been overwhelmingly positive, and man, it's been great. I mean, I couldn't be more pleased.
Now, I've seen on your social media pages, you have so many big names in the music industry that are posing with the book and posing with you and reading the book and giving you great feedback from what you had wrote. You had 26 great years, so to speak, with Eddie Van Halen. What do you think people most misunderstood about him?
On some levels, he was a very complex person. And on some levels, he was a very simple person. By simple, I mean it was easy to understand him, and hence the title of the book, Tonechaser: Understanding Edward, which kind of works on two levels. So understanding Edward, as you mentioned, yes, trying to understand him, but understanding as a I think it's an adjective. Understanding Edward as like a kind-hearted Edward. He was an incredibly understanding person. In all the hours that I spent with him, and I would say something stupid or insulting, not intentionally, he would never say, "Oh, fuck you, man. Why would you say that?" He never reacted like that. I mean, had he reacted like that, I would have, I think the same way anybody would have, I would have shriveled up and just, crawled off into the corner. Having this guy be angry at me or upset with me. I don't think people understand how important respect was to Edward. We all know that David Lee Roth leaves the band, at the height of their popularity. And Edward was incredibly angry. And yes, he was angry that Dave left at that point in their career. But it was really more to do with the way Dave left. He just left, He's just like, hey, I'm done. I'm gone here. And to Edward, that just reeks of disrespect. And Edward could just not get past that. Though he would do those reunions with him down the road, which I could never understand, because he says some things about Dave in the book that are pretty mean, and pretty negative, which I get. And yet he would go and get back together with Dave. And that's that other side of Edward. In some respects, he would take the path of least resistance. And rather than maybe look for a new singer at that point, hey, I know Dave and, we don't get along, but I've worked with him, so I'm going to get back together with Dave. So I think the respect thing with Edward was paramount. And I don't think people quite understood that. He was a very self-confident guy. He was very sure about his skills. Not that he would go around saying, oh man, did you hear that solo I did on the Fair Warning record? Man, wasn't that the fucking greatest, man? And I blew everybody away. Nobody could play that solo like me, you know. He never, ever spoke like that or looked on his own, talents that way. But he knew he was a very good guitar player, in the moments, I realized and recognized that early on. So there were moments when I just couldn't hold myself back, where I would normally go, oh yeah, man, that's really good, and try not to go overboard and be a sycophant or some nerd guy just geeking out on his guitar playing. But there were moments when I would do that, and he wouldn't get angry, but it would be like it irritated him, because he didn't need to hear me or anybody say what an unbelievably great solo that was. He just didn't need to hear it. I think on some level, he thought by somebody saying that they were sort of defining what his music was, and that the solo was this, and I don't think in his head, I don't think his music could be defined that way, So early on, I recognized, don't say those things. Don't go overboard about his solos. Now, on the other hand, there were moments when he would play me something, and in my head, I'm thinking, now don't go hyperbolic on him. Don't go insane. He would play something for me, and I go, yeah, it's good, And he'd go, well, didn't you think it was good? I liked it, So there was part of him, yes, that still needed to hear that, And so which goes into that piece of him that maybe people didn't really recognize was, I don't know if it was an insecurity thing, but man, we all want people to say to us, wow, man, I'm proud of what you did, With Edward, he didn't need that on a daily basis, but he just had to know that you had his back. So he was fragile that way, He loved his family. I mean, he loved Alex. He loved his father. When his father passed away, I mean, that was really hard for him. I think he had a strained relationship with his mother. And I think all that, and I tried to write about that as astutely as I could. And I think all of that, kind of feeds into, who he was. He was not solely that bigger than life person we see on the live stage with a great smile, playing the brilliant guitar. I mean, that was certainly one part of him. The other part is Edward Van Halen, unplugged, sitting at home and dealing with life the way the rest of us do. So.
Now, without betraying any confidence, and this may just be a yes or a no answer from you, and that's fine, was there anything that you left out of the book intentionally that you may have put in there to begin with, but once Eddie passed away, you were like, I'm kind of going to take that out?
Honestly, there were pieces that I knew before he passed away. There's just a couple pieces. Honestly, 99% of everything that I had experienced with Edward and recorded and remembered went into the book. There was a couple small pieces. They were as much to do with me as they were with Edward, but it was an exchange. And I thought, you know what, I'm going to keep that for myself. That's for me and the memory of Edward. So, but it was pretty much all laid out there. I really wanted to write the most honest book that I possibly could, hence the 480 pages. So.
Right. Now, there's over 50 hours of conversation with Eddie?
I think there's about a total of 50 hours. There is. We had talked earlier. I have an audiobook version, and the audiobook version is I think it clocks in as a little over 30 hours. Just to give you some idea, most audiobooks are about the third of that length.
Right.
So rarely do you come across an audiobook that's 30 hours. And I was just able to get the book up on Audible, which of course is Amazon's format. And that felt really good. Audible, they have their own proprietary format, ACX, and only you can only play an Audible audiobook on Audible.
Right.
So you kind of have to prescribe to their logistics and their format. But I was pretty happy to get that up there. So and again, not trying to do an advertisement here, but if you've read the book, listening to the audiobook is really truly remarkable. And I say that because so I do the main narration. So all of the narration in the book that you would or you have read is in my voice. And just doing that narration, my God, that took me like 6 or 7 months to get through, trying to read and not stumble over your words, and sometimes a word it'll start to look funny if it's used a lot when you write. And I think there's a term for that. I don't know what it is. The same thing, like when I was speaking it, I would stumble over that word time and time again, So that was kind of bothersome. But all of the interviews that we just talked about are in Edward's voice. So I went back, got all of the original interviews and embedded those in the audiobook. So you were hearing these really rare and kind of archival conversations with Edward dating back to 1978, which is when I first interviewed him. And honestly, I don't know of another audiobook that does that, where the subject of the audiobook, whether it's a musician or an athlete or a movie star, is embedded with that actual with their actual voice. It's always a narrator doing that, and I think that's because who's ever narrating, just doesn't have all of that content on tape. It's never been recorded, and I was in the unique position because I was a writer and hanging out that I have all that recorded, and what I was writing and all the interviews, I did have on tape. So it's really pretty amazing. And there's also little segments where he's noodling. We'd be talking and he'd have a guitar in his hand. And in fact, he always had a guitar in his hand, and he'd be noodling around, and you can hear that on tape. And it's just incredible just hearing that. And there are bits and pieces. He would come over to where I was living in the Hollywood Hills. I lived in Laurel Canyon. Edward lived in Coldwater Canyon, and that was about 10 minutes apart. And so he would come over and he would play me rough mixes of albums that hadn't come out yet. And he did that for the second and third records. And he'd come over and he'd play me these rough mixes. And then we'd go up into my, we'd listen to these on tapes in his car. And then we'd go up into my little guest house, and he'd play all of those songs acoustically on one of my electric guitars. I had a couple of electrics, So he was playing for the second Dance the Night Away and Beautiful Girls, I think, acoustically on my electric guitar. And it's amazing. I mean, to me, that's worth the price of the whole audiobook. But anyway, for those fans out there, I think the audiobook is an amazing sort of companion piece to the hardback. So
how long's the audiobook been out? I know it's recent.
So again, on Audible, it's literally been out a week. It's up on a site called Soundwise, but Soundwise makes it available on all these other formats. So you can go find it on Spotify. It's up on Apple iTunes, and various other audiobook sites. And I think that's been up, I don't know, I want to say 8-10 months. So not that long, really. It's still relatively new. It's amazing. I mean, it really is. It turned out much better than I thought it would. I had to go back and I had my friend Adam Roach. You know, I wanted to get the audio as clean, and as high fidelity as we could. So he went through and he cleaned it. He tried to EQ it, and equalize it and normalize it. Again, because I was recording on cheap little cassette players, cheap microphones, 50-cent cassette tapes, literally, So it took a lot of that, but I think the audio is really came out really cool. And you realize sort of by the quality of the audio that what you're hearing really is archival. You know what I mean? It has sort of a vintage kind of a sound to it. So it's pretty cool. I'm really happy with it. Yeah.
So do you think in Eddie's mind, and just during the time that you knew him on a very personal level, do you believe that he was always chasing that elusive perfect tone, or do you believe somewhere deep down he believes he found it?
That's a great question. No, I think he was always looking, which sort of runs into the idea of, well, what would Edward be doing now? What kind of music would he be playing now? I think in his, pursuit of the perfect tone, I could hear Edward he could coax sounds out of a cello. He was a keyboard player. I think he played a little bit of sax and horns from his dad, So I could have heard him doing more kind of orchestral stuff, movie soundtrack stuff. I thought he would have been amazing at that. I know he did some of that stuff back in the day. He did some of that, but it was basically guitar-oriented stuff. But I think he always would have been pursuing new guitar tones. It's funny. I mean, a lot of people will tell you, well, his greatest guitar sounds were on maybe those first two records, Then some guys will say, well, what about the sound on the Fair Warning record, which was amazing. Then on, 1984, which is their sixth album, 1984 record. I mean, that's a next generation guitar tone for Edward. 5150, it changes again.
Right.
And I think maybe that was because, they have a new singer, Edward's writing differently. But in answer to your question, yes, I think he would always be pursuing new things. I think he'd still be building guitars and trying different configurations. And yeah, I don't think he was ever happy. I don't know if he was ever happy with an album, to be honest with you. It's not like he would say, oh my God, wasn't the 5150 record amazing? That's the greatest thing I could ever do. Again, he would never talk like that. So yeah, I think the pursuit would have been a lifelong one for him, for sure.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with you on that. I have a couple more questions for you. I know you said Eddie was not a reader. Now that the audio book is out, if he was still alive today and he was listening to the audio book, what would you hope he'd think of it?
That's an interesting premise. So I'm going to take a worst case scenario here. So I'm assuming that we were never going to be friends like we were. So let's go from that standpoint. Yeah,
Sure.
And I do this, and I go, Edward, look, I wrote a book and I came out with an audiobook version. Would you want to hear any of it? I would hope that if he did listen to any of it, that he would say, this is really honest. This is what we experienced. This is what I experienced with Steve, and this is what Steve experienced with me. I don't know if we can ever be friends again, Steve, but I've listened to a little bit of this. I'm happy you did it. I'm not going to listen to the entire audiobook, but I'm happy you did it. As the most positive thing, I would hope that he'd hear it and go, oh my God, I forgot about that. And oh my God, listen to me playing you those songs from the second record. And oh, I forgot about that. And oh, we're talking about my dad. And as I mentioned at the outset, I would hope that would have opened up, the drawbridge would have lowered, and we
Right.
would met in the middle and hugged each other. You know, even if he didn't say, "I'm happy you did it," he would have said, "It's okay that you did this. I understand. I've listened to a little bit, and I can understand, what the rest of it must sound like, So that to me would be, you know, I think about that. If Edward was still around when the book was finished, what would he have said? I mean, in my mind, that would have been amazing. That would have been all I needed. On the other hand, let me go back. I was going to reach out to Edward before I began writing the book. Though, now remember again, I hadn't spoken to him for 17 years.
Right.
I had reached out to him via, I had the email of his wife/manager. And I remember sending a couple emails and I never heard anything. Basically, Edward, hi, I just wanted to see how you were. I miss our friendship. I hope you're well. I love you, man. I never heard anything back. I got his phone number. I had his phone number from back in the day. I remember I dialed it one day. This is probably, I don't know, 2015, 2016, I mean, it took me a long time to build up the courage to make that call. And it was a voice. It was numbers out of order, which I figured by then it had been, that number could have been 40 years old. Someone else gave me his current number at the time. And I think it was another year or so later. And I, punch in the numbers and his voice comes on. And I swear to God, I almost had a heart attack. And it was a message. And again, I basically left the same message. Hi, Edward, this is Steve Rosen. And I just wanted to say hello. And I miss you so much, man. And, I hope you're good. Give me a call. And I never heard from him. So I never heard from him in those 17 years. I sit down to write the book in 2020. I was going to reach out to him before I started writing the book, but I didn't. I don't know why. Maybe that was just a little bit of selfishness on my part, or maybe it was, hey, 17 years have gone by. I've tried to reach out to you, and I'm gonna write the book. I'm gonna start the book. Had I reached out to him before starting the book, and if he had said to me, "Do not write that book," I never would have written the book. His opinion of me and what he thought, even though it had been 17 years, still mattered greatly to me. And if he didn't want me to write the book, I wasn't going to write the book. I just didn't need that kind of sort of, bad karma, bad vibes, floating out there in the world, And again, it goes back to respect, though we weren't friends, I still had incredible respect for him and the friendship we once had. So yeah, it was sad. I mean, it was sad, I mean, I really wish he had been here when the book was finished,
I can hear that in your voice, that you miss him and, you wanted to reconcile.
Yeah, badly. I mean, and again, I write over and over in the book, what did I do? What did I say to him? What action had I taken that would have sort of caused the end of our relationship to happen that way? Look, I can be your friend for 10 years and then think, well, Joseph, listen, man, it's, I'm moving on. I've got different things in my life. We can't be friends anymore. And, that would be hurtful to you. You can be friends and not be friends with anybody you want. But it'd be different if, I kind of, called you up and said in very nasty terms, you're not worthy of being my friend and said hurtful things to you. You'd go, wow. Or maybe you're the type of person you say, well, fuck him, and some people would say that. I wasn't that kind of person. I take it personally, so that's what, again, I go back. What did I say to him? What did I do? And I really came to the conclusion that it was nothing I said or did. I do believe there was Edward going through different things in his life, and I write about those moments in the book. It was sad. It was really sad, to be sure.
Do you have a relationship of any sort with Alex or Wolf?
I do not. Have not spoken to either of them. Well, Wolf I've never spoken to, and Alex I haven't spoken to since probably 85 or 86. It's not like we were good friends, but I ran into a fair amount. He lived, pretty close to Edward as well. And he'd be over at, 5150, and I'd be over there. And, it was friendly. And I actually write about in the book, we actually went out on a double date. Alex and his then girlfriend, and me and my girlfriend. I mean, it was one of the best nights I've ever had. So I mean, we were pretty. He was comfortable around me. And again, without wanting to give the book away, I wrote this, what I thought was this very innocuous little comment about Van Halen were going to go on the road. They were actually going to tour Europe, opening for Bon Jovi. And Alex made some comments that weren't so nice about Bon Jovi, and I printed them. I mean, it was just, it just didn't seem like any big deal. And then Edward says, "Oh man, Alex hates you for fucking saying that shit." And I go, "Wow, I had no idea." I mean, I'm sorry. And so I kind of think that Alex still has that in the back of his head about, as sort of his last encounter with me. So yeah, no, I haven't spoken to Alex again, probably since. I'm sorry. This happened later. Probably since around '95. It was right around the Balance album, I think. So it was a little bit later. Wolfgang, I've never met. Again, in the book, Edward actually talks about Wolf, and Wolf is about 11 years old at that point, and he's telling me what an incredible musician he is at 11 years old. I'm probably one of the first people outside of the family that Edward ever talked to about his son.
Wow.
It's not like he was doing interviews and talking about his son. He hadn't done any when Wolf was 11. So yeah, I mean, I would love to talk to Wolf. I mean, even if he had no desire to read the book, and I'm assuming maybe he wouldn't. I don't even know if he knows about the book. I think maybe he does. I have no idea. But just the fact that I knew Edward, all those years before he was born. And it's like I could, tell him stuff about his dad.
Right.
That, maybe he would like to hear, things that, even Alex, just because Alex wasn't there. And, the relationship, the dynamic between family is much different than friends, right? I mean, in some situations, I mean, it's maybe even a little more open between friends, because you can tell a friend stuff that you can't tell your brother, right? Or, your wife or whatever. But yeah, so no, I haven't, I have no communications with any of the Van Halen people, nor Valerie. She was delightful and we were pretty friendly with each other, and now haven't spoken to her for many, 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 many decades. So
I can only hope that somewhere down the road, this book can get in one of their hands and in a positive way bring some type of closure for you.
that would be great. I mean, I think about that. I can't dwell on it, but I think about it a lot. And again, the book is really honest, and Edward makes comments about Valerie. I mean, though he professes deep love and they loved each other dearly. So some of the comments aren't most positive, but I felt they had to be in there because you were talking about these things. Well, what do people maybe not know? Well, I think that in those moments, here's somebody who on the surface has it all, right? I mean, he's successful and he's amazing looking and he's talented and he has a beautiful wife and he has money and he has the cars and the house, but he still has these these things in his life that none of those things, none of them are answers for the turmoil, that friction between husband and wife kind of thing. So I would hope that she wouldn't just focus on that, because I write about her in these chapters where it's totally positive, but I don't know. But she's been on podcasts and TV, and she talks about that relationship, and it gets pretty honest. It gets pretty dark, right?
Yeah, I've heard her.
Right.
Yeah.
But I mean, Yeah. I mean, I guess at the end of the day, I guess I would hope that these people would think, you know what? This is a long book. This must have taken him a lot of fucking work to do, you know. Um, and we've seen, you know, comments from other people and all these other musicians, you know, saying positive things. So, you know, the book is probably a positive book. You know, we're never going to read it, but it's probably okay, you know. And so in their mind, I become sort of this benign presence, neither good nor bad, that just kind of works in the background. You know, I suppose I would, you know, if that's as good as it ever gets, you know,
Mhm.
I guess I would just have to, you know, kind of be happy with that. But yeah, it'd be amazing, you know, if life worked out where there would be some connection somewhere, and you know, you could sit down and, you know, talk to these people and you know, reconnect on some level. You know, that'd be
Yeah.
great if life worked that way. So we'll see. Maybe there's still time. Who
Yeah.
knows?
And sometimes no news is good news.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. I have to ask you the most controversial question that has been going on for years about Eddie Van Halen, okay? Are you a Van Halen fan or a Van Hagar fan?
It's pretty close. I mean, I do sway to the Dave years, only because the preponderance of our relationship happened during that period, right?
Right.
So if I met Edward in '85, you know, when you know Sammy had just joined the band, would I have felt that those Sammy era records were better than the Dave era records? I guess that would be the true test, really.
Mhm.
You know, maybe I would feel that way, but you know, I feel so sort of connected to those early records again because he would, you know, sort of preview some of the records for me, and I was interviewing him about all of those albums. I mean, I did interview him about 5150 and you know some of those records, but by then the relationship was starting to sort of dissolve and disintegrate. So maybe I was listening to those albums with the jaundiced ear.
Mhm.
Um, it's funny. I mean, I think the reason you have sort of that ongoing McCoy's Hatfield War is because Van Halen meant so much to their fans.
Yeah.
Um, you know, that this battle still rages. Um, I mean, I'm trying to think of another band, and there aren't many, where they've lost the singer, the original singer, a new singer comes in, and they still have extraordinary success. And one of the bands I can think of is AC/DC. Oh man, the
Mhm.
Bon Scott records were greatest, or oh, Brian has been, you know, the singer for so much longer, and all those huge records were done, you know, when Brian was a singer. You know, I know there's a couple more bands where that has happened. Um, Van Halen fans are rabid. You know,
Mhm.
I mean, my God, Edward passed away. We're coming up on 5 years, right?
Yeah.
And my God, he's in the news almost daily, you know, and he's on all these podcasts. I mean, it's just a testament to the legacy that he and the band left behind. But in answer to your question, I have to default to those Dave era records, and I don't want to get in trouble. I don't want anybody to start screaming at me. And it wasn't necessarily because that Dave was a singer and or Sammy was the singer. It's just because again, I was with Edward during when those records were being made, and for me, I just thought his guitar playing and the songwriting, I just you know, I just connected with it so much more. You know, I just thought he was it was a little more organic, it was more raw. You know, it was a little I don't want to use it. It was a little less refined. You know, later on, you know, there's a lot of overdubbing that goes on, which is great. You know, but those early records, you know, the overdubs were minimal, and for me, I just liked hearing those kinds of records. You know, so I have to cast my vote for David Lee Roth. Yeah. So
Good choice. You know, but I'm going to play it safe and go the Gary Sharon years.
you are.
Yeah, no, I'm being sarcastic. No.
I like that record.
Yeah.
Look, I know nobody else did. I know it was a failure by Van Halen standards. The reality of it is no one was going to accept a third singer into Van Halen,
No.
right?
Yeah.
Right? It could have been Paul Rogers, or it wasn't going to matter
No.
at that point in time. They weren't going to accept, I liked Gary's voice. I kind of liked his lyrics. They were a little outside. I liked his melodies, but what do I know, right? I mean,
Hey, we're all entitled to our opinions, and
yeah, you think of Dave, those early 80s records. I mean, the band just seemed so much more rebellious,
yeah.
and I think that connected with a lot of people.
Yeah.
Sammy, the approach was a little different. It was more musical on levels. Again, we talk about Sammy's range, and that allowed Edward to write different things. Here's my theory. I think that if you grew up and your first album was an album with Dave on it, you were a fan of those records. And if your first record you heard was one of Sammy's records, you were a Sammy fan. The real acid test is how many people, and it works both ways, how many people heard and were growing up hearing all of the Dave era records, but were more Sammy fans, and vice versa.
Yes.
Younger fans who grew up, hearing 5150 as their first record, like the Dave era records better. And I will bet you it's a very, very small percentage of people who, grew up hearing, those records of Dave that prefer the albums with Sammy, and vice versa. I mean, it's what we grew up with, right? I mean,
Right.
You grew up listening to Zeppelin and Hendrix. I mean, were you going to be more of a Bon Jovi and Aerosmith fan? No, you're not. I mean,
No.
I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's those memories that are attached to that, and hearing that first Zeppelin record, right, or hearing the first Bon Jovi record, and what you were doing, and who was your girlfriend at the time, blah blah blah. So,
100%. We talk about that all the time on this podcast. What do songs mean to you? And
yeah, that's cool. Obviously the name of your podcast, Joseph, marks a spot. I mean, yeah, I mean, which is why, music is the universal language. And, I think you remember more where you were and what you were doing when you heard that song, as opposed to when you read that book, or when you saw that painting, or a television show. In my mind, anyway, that's the way it is. I wrote in the book, when that first Van Halen record came out, everybody else, every other writer, every other person thought it was amazing. It was incredible. I thought it kind of sucked. And I wrote about that. I shouldn't say I thought it sucked. I just didn't think, I didn't think much of it. I thought, yeah, he's a good guitar player. And as I'm writing those words, I'm trying to think, why do I feel that way?
mm-hmm.
Everybody else around me sees it as this groundbreaking record. What is it you don't see? And is it a conscious thing that you don't want to see it? And it was really tied up in those emotions. So for me, I think about those first guitar players and those first bands I heard and were really aware of were, bands like Free and early Procol Harum and Traffic, and Jimi Hendrix and the Who and the first Jeff Beck group. So those are the guitar players and the bands that I'm listening to. And so I hear Edward playing this, and I go, yeah, it's okay, but it sounds like, I've heard Ritchie Blackmore do those kinds of fast shuffles with Deep Purple, infinitely more effectively, and that was my thought process, because I can remember hearing the first Jeff Beck record and, seeing Jeff Beck live, and I was transformed by it. I was just a young, I was young then. It was like, it was mind blowing to me. I didn't want to think that there was this new guy who could be that good, because in my mind, it would make those guys disappear, and would make my memories disappear, because this is a new guy, and is he the new voice, and so all those things went through my head. The next day I sat down and listened to the record very carefully, and I realized, oh my God, he is, the new king. But yeah, it's where you are, what you're doing, yeah, for at those important moments of our life, it's amazing.
Well, Steve, I am going to wrap it up here for today. We are at the hour mark.
Ah,
And yes, so if there's anything else you want to say about the book or in the audio book, please go ahead. Feel free.
I would just say if anybody is interested in the audiobook, excuse me, you can find it on my website. Very simple, tonechaserbook.com, one word. And if you're Amazon fans out there, just go to Amazon, type Tonechaser up in the space bar there. You can find it on Amazon, and it's also on eBay. And if you're on Reverb and you're buying some guitar strings or a new amp, it's also up on Reverb. So just type in Tonechaser. And, if you're a Van Halen fan, I think you guys would really dig the book. So go buy it.
Steve, hey, thank you so much for joining me. Again, it was truly an honor having you on this show.
Thank you so much, Joseph. Thanks for the wonderful questions. And happy holiday to you and everybody out there listening.
And same to you.
Steve's story of Eddie Van Halen is almost right out of Van Halen's Finish What You Started. That's exactly what Steve has done writing this book, because in so many ways, like Eddie, Steve was chasing something, closure. And I can only wish him nothing but the best and success. I hope you find peace, Steve, with this book. You have definitely done Eddie some justice. And Eddie, thank you. And I know everybody's going to get this when I say this. Eddie, thank you for leaving a little bit of heaven right here on earth. Standing on top of the world with Gen X Marks the Spot podcast, I'm Joe Augustine. Peace out. Props for listening, everyone.